I am now switching hats from keynote to moderator of this panel. It's about the ongoing challenges of preventing and addressing hate violence. And I think it's great to have this particular panel of folks here who are deep in the space of the work that's being done both in government and outside to address and prevent hate violence. My panelists, starting from the very end, we have Sim Singh, who's the National Advocacy Manager for the Sikh Coalition. Then to his left, we have Robert Moosey, who is Deputy Assistant Attorney General in the Civil Rights Division. He was my deputy as well and is currently a career deputy in the Civil Rights Division and was the former chief also of the criminal section of the Civil Rights Division, which prosecutes hate crimes. So he has extensive experience in this issue. To his left is Kristen Clark, my good friend who's president and executive director of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under Law, which has been a partner with us at the Leadership Conference on some really important hate initiatives that you'll be hearing about, and maybe Kristen will also situate some of that work within the broader anti-discrimination work that the Lawyers Committee is doing now as well. And then to her left is Abid Ayoub, who's the National Legal and Policy Director for the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee. And so this is a pretty extraordinary panel of folks here today. I want to just open up with a couple of comments, and then I'm going to be asking the panelists a bunch of different questions, and I'll try to save room and time at the end, about 10 or 15 minutes for audience questions if there is such an inclination. Do you guys hear feedback as I'm speaking? I don't know if moving it away is better. Does that help? Okay. So I think just in thinking about the moment that we're in, I think there's no question right now that it's time for the country to redouble our efforts to combat hate in America. Over the past few years, and some would say in particular since the 2016 election, there's been really a frightening rise of hate and bias incidents around the country. And we've seen also a surge in hate speech, which presents complications, obviously, with a country that has as its First Amendment, the First Amendment. And hate rhetoric and hate incidents against the LGBT community, Muslims, Jews, South Asians, immigrants, refugees, people of color around the country, people with disabilities, and the like. And protecting the rights of the most vulnerable to hate incidents is really, I think, a priority of many organizations' work, and has been and continues to be, as I see it, a priority for the Civil Rights Division. Just at the helm of the Leadership Conference, as I mentioned before, the nation's largest and most diverse coalition of over 200 national civil rights organizations, we are feeling a particular responsibility among our organizations to rise to this challenge. And some of the folks here are representing organizations that are members of the Leadership Conference. I think it's hard to deny that the events in Charlottesville in August and the aftermath and official response were particularly painful and really demonstrated the importance of unequivocal denunciation of hate where it occurs and of robust enforcement by the government. And also, though, the responsibility of community groups and the obligation, I would say, of community groups around the country to serve as a bridge between vulnerable victims of hate violence and law enforcement. And we also, though, can't be engaged on these issues and efforts after an act of violence occurs. We are, I think, right now as a country in a time where there's a lot of political turmoil and divisiveness. We need to also figure out how we are advancing values of diversity and inclusion to prevent hate violence from taking place to begin with. One of the issues that we're going to be talking about is the data issue, and just one of the first steps is to how do we even document hate violence that's happening, because we can't really address it without fully understanding it. Where is it most prevalent? What communities is it impacting, and the like? And that's why the Leadership Conference is joined together with about 18 partner organizations across racial, gender, religious, and sexual orientation to launch Communities Against Hate, which is a diverse coalition of groups that are coming together for the first time around the country to document hate and take action. And there's a lot more that I'll talk about there later on, but the website is www.communitiesagainst.hate.org. And the Lawyers Committee will be talking about some of its partner work in this realm as well. So let me just start here by asking Kristen Clark about, there's been a lot said, I just said it myself, about whether there's a link between kind of the 2016 election cycle and kind of the surge in hate that people are sensing. And I would just like to know, you were the head of the Lawyers Committee at the time during the election. What did you see really in the course of your work on these issues?
Yeah, thank you for that opening, Vanita, and thanks for the opportunity to speak on such an incredibly important and timely issue. The Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law leads a nonpartisan voter protection program called Election Protection. It's anchored by a hotline, 866-OUR-VOTE, and also includes a field program where we work with lawyers, many from law firms. We work with law schools and local and state and national civil rights organizations to safeguard access to the ballot box. And the 2016 election cycle was one that was fraught with an unusually high number of reports from voters and would-be voters about voter suppression. And not just suppression aimed at denying everyone access to the ballot box. I'm talking about a lot of rhetoric that was racially charged, that was xenophobic and anti-immigrant. These were the kinds of reports and complaints that we were hearing from people who were going out to their early voting sites and encountering people who were positioned outside of polling sites with the specific goal of intimidating people of color from exercising the right to vote. Beyond the animus that we learned of, exhibited by individuals, we also saw local and state officials around the country engage in what almost felt like a coordinated campaign to make voting harder for historically protected minority groups. So whether you're talking about the long standing battle around Texas's photo ID law, which had a heavier burden on poor Black and Latino voters and would-be voters in Texas, whether you're talking about North Carolina, where ultimately the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals found that state officials acted with, quote, almost surgical precision to put in place a law that made it harder for African Americans to vote. We really saw across the country efforts that were targeted at making it harder and discouraging. We're all about discouraging and deterring historically protected minority groups from exercising their voice in our democracy. So through election protection, we work to try to troubleshoot and overcome some of these problems. But most importantly, we want minority communities to know that there's somebody who's got their back, somebody who is stand up and prepared to litigate and fight back against some of the more deep and systemic issues that reared their ugly head throughout the 2016 election cycle. But I think it's fair to say, Vanita, that the 2016 election sadly was a bit of a turning point in the hate crime crisis. I think that the election cycle was one again marred by racially charged and xenophobic rhetoric. And now looming over this, I think, is a question about what role Russia played in fanning the flames of hatred there. I don't think we fully understand or have a grapple on the impact that Russia-driven propaganda had on stirring the pot during the 2016 election cycle. This week we saw Congress opening up hearings to look into Facebook, Twitter, Google, and how Russia propaganda may have impacted the election cycle. So I think there's a lot of important work that needs to be done to safeguard the right to vote, Vanita, but also some important work that we need to do to address some of these new and emerging challenges. This Russian propaganda problem, I think, is one of them.
So thanks. I want to turn to Robert Musi now, who, as I mentioned, has both been a criminal prosecutor himself in the hate crime space, but also is now a Deputy Assistant Attorney General. And Robert, you have been at the division kind of pre the passage of the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act. That was a really important piece of legislation that passed, that became law 8 years ago. It would just be helpful, I think, if you could just explain to this room what the act did vis-a-vis the prior existing law, and also how the Justice Department has been using this law since 2009 in the hate crime space.
Sure. It's a pleasure to be here. As Vanita said, I'm a career criminal prosecutor. I started at DOJ in 1994. So I've been there about 23 years, have over 20 years experience prosecuting hate crimes. Ultimately, I now supervise the office that prosecutes all federal hate crimes in partnership with FBI and the U.S. Attorney's offices. And that's an office of about 60 federal prosecutors here in D.C. And they fly all over the United States and work on all the federal hate crimes prosecutions across the country. And as I said, our real partners are assistant U.S. attorneys and FBI agents. And, you know, the federal criminal statutes that empower us as a federal government to bring criminal prosecutions in federal court, as opposed to whatever may be happening at the state level criminally, because most hate crimes can either be a state hate crime or a state assault or something like that, as well as a federal hate crime. The statutes that empower the federal government really came about in the 1960s. They started in the 1960s, and there have been several iterations of statutes. Not to say that the federal government wasn't trying to prosecute hate violence earlier. During the era of Jim Crow, during the lynching times in our United States, the federal government and the Civil Rights Division, at that time based in the Criminal Division, was trying to bring lynching prosecutions and was losing over and over, and the cases were getting thrown out of court because at that time it was held that private actors' acts of hate and discrimination in violation of the 13th Amendment weren't covered by federal law and weren't cognizable. And it really wasn't until the Civil Rights Movement in the 60s, sort of the culmination of the Civil Rights Movement, that Congress passed a set of hate crime statutes, both under the 13th Amendment and the Commerce Clause, that empowered the government to go into federal courts and prosecute hate crimes, in particular where local jurisdictions weren't willing to do that. And I think in the 60s and 70s, you know, there's a history in our country of the federal government, I think, really leading the charge in that way of prosecuting a lot of hate violence. But those statutes were limited. Congress didn't want to give us a sort of plenary hate crimes authority. So it said, well, in the 60s statutes that really weren't changed until about 2009 when Shepard-Byrd was enacted, we're going to limit what the kinds of hate crimes the federal government can prosecute. So we're going to allow you to prosecute hate crimes based, say, just on race or religion or national origin, and only where, in addition to the motivation of the defendant being the hate bias, it's because he wanted to deprive that victim of participating in a federally protected activity. So the first hate crime statutes really had two kind of motivational elements. Somebody used force or threat because of, and I'll just use the term race, but it was a little broader than that, and because the victim wanted to engage in a federally protected activity. And it enumerated those activities to be things like voting, education, public accommodations, employment, obtaining a federal service or benefit. So not just a punch on the street, not a murder in a home or on the street somewhere where actually most hate violence actually happens in the kind of public arena, but limited really to these kind of federally protected activities. And the federal government was sort of thinking, or the Congress at that time was thinking, these limitations kind of help us cabin the role of the federal government. And I think, and then at that same time, they passed a hate crime statute that talked about housing, saying you can't discriminate in housing. If you use violence because someone's trying to live somewhere or rent an apartment, then that can be a federal hate crime. So really, up until the 2000s, the hate crimes were really very limited to these double motive hate crimes because of hate and because the person was participating in a certain set of activities. What we learned, I think, in enforcing these crimes was that a lot of hate violence happens on the street and doesn't always happen with that double motive. And that Congress realized after, I would say, 10 years of debate, or 13 years of debate, that it would make sense to broaden the federal hate crime statute. And in 2009, they enacted the Shepard-Byrd Hate Crime Prevention Act which got rid of that second federally protected activity requirement that had been in the earlier hate crime statutes. And what Shepard-Byrd really did is it said, okay, we want to, in some ways, be as expansive as possible. And that is in the groups covered. So we want to cover as many of the diverse components of our thriving society as we possibly can. And so we're certainly going to cover race, color, religion, national origin, the things that have been covered before and that were really thought of as the primary targets of hate violence back in the 60s. But also in modern times, we were seeing hate crimes because of gender, because of sexual orientation, because of gender identity, and because of disability. And so they expanded the groups covered in the Shepard-Byrd Act to include that second set: religion, national origin, gender, sexual identity, gender identity, and disability. There was one little kink, which is that the 13th Amendment doesn't cover a lot of those groups. The 13th Amendment has been interpreted to cover what was considered to be racial violence or race at the time it was enacted in the late 1800s. Gender identity, sexual orientation weren't included. So they added a Commerce Clause requirement. So there's a new element that crimes, because of this expanded group, have to be also affecting interstate commerce, which is actually a significant element sometimes to overcome. And in some ways, as I said, it was broader because it got rid of the second motive and it expanded the groups, but in some ways it's narrower in that Shepard-Byrd only covers causing bodily injury. It does not cover threatening behavior, does not cover the whole world of attempts unless that attempt was done with a dangerous weapon. So whereas the earlier statutes covered all kinds of violence, arsons, bodily injury, threats, things like that, this new statute is in some ways more limited in that it only covers causing bodily injury. How we've been really using that statute, it's been a great help to us. We've expanded the number of cases we've brought, and we've also expanded, I think one way that it's really, helped the federal effort is that it's the first time gender identity has been included in a federal statute. And what that meant is we went out and partnered with transgender community groups and started providing training to federal agents about gender identity. What is gender identity? What does it mean? How would you collect evidence in a sensitive way if you have a transgender victim? And so in addition to expanding our prosecution authority, it expanded our training and outreach authority to build partnerships with groups that we hadn't had a legal cause to go out there and train with and create partnerships with. And so I think it's helped in a number of ways expand our overall civil rights mission. And we've been bringing a number of cases. I would say we've frankly brought less gender identity cases than we would like, but if you've seen in the Times recently, the Attorney General Sessions is particularly interested in this category of hate crimes, and we're doing a considerable amount of work to try to do a better job of identifying transgender hate crimes. We've certainly done a number of GLBT hate crimes, and we continue to prosecute plain old racial and religious hate crimes like we've been doing for a number of years. And I would say for us, what we're really seeing and how we see kind of hate violence move over time, increase or decrease, is with significant public events. And the biggest one of those for me, or I think for those of us who've been there a while, was 9/11. And after 9/11, we saw a dramatic increase in hate crimes against the Masa community. And we have to say really the whole Masa community, because the people committing these crimes are attacking Sikhs or attacking anybody that they perceive to be Arab or Muslim, whether they are or not. And I think we've seen an increase in those crimes, and we've really been trying to be responsive to that.
Thank you, Robert. It's like you knew what my next set of questions were going to be.
You could tell
But no, I think it's really important, though, for people to have that kind of granular understanding of the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act, because before I had been in the Justice Department, you kind of have some notions of what the Hate Crime Authority is that the feds have, but to have that kind of broken down, I think is really important. So, but let me turn to when Robert says Masa, that's Muslim, Arab, Sikh, South Asian, and those perceived to be of those communities. And we have two leaders from that bundle of communities, a very heterogeneous set of communities that have been long at work for both the Sikh Coalition and the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee has the Arab American Anti-Discrimination Committee have been around for quite some time, and if the Sikh Coalition came to be after 9/11, and ADC has been around for 37 years. And I would like to just get your perspective on how the role of, like, what the work of both of your organizations has changed, in particular over the last 15 years since 9/11. In this space, whether it's as a result of changing external events or even the introduction of the Matthew Shepard law or not. So let me start first with you, Sim, if you could just speak to some of that.
Sure, absolutely. And thank you for having me, and thank you, Criminal Justice Section, for having me as well. And just to give you some color as to how the Sikh Coalition got founded, days after 9/11, a Sikh gentleman was shot down and murdered in front of his gas station in Arizona. And this was the result of a quote-unquote retribution. And this is what spurred our community to organize, and we've continued to work on anti-discrimination work, whether it's through employment matters, police profiling, or even bullying. What we found out is that our community is deeply affected by these issues, and they had been even prior to 9/11, but 9/11 really galvanized us. And what was really problematic around the 9/11 era was that there was this media narrative that our community was subject to hate crimes because of a mistaken identity, and that's not always the case. It's actually a problematic framing that there is a correct type of target out there, that we should be targeting a Muslim, not a Sikh person or an Arab person or a Hindu person. That's just not what we wanted to promote. What we've been advocating for is that there shouldn't be any target, and that's what we've really been trying to push forward. It doesn't matter if it's a Sikh, and it doesn't matter if the offender thought that Sikh was a Muslim. So we've been very consistent about making it clear that hate crime against one community is a hate crime against all the communities. So we have stood in solidarity with other communities. We're partners with the Lawyers Committee as well, Leadership Conference. And we're also part of the Report Hate initiative as well, to share these hate incident data across other organizations. So this is where we've been at, but as of the past year or so, we've moved towards more grassroots initiatives. We feel like at the federal level, there's limited scope in order to work on hate crime issues. So what we're trying to do now is build stronger community connections. And over the past couple months, in fact, we've been in touch with over 5,000 government officials to raise awareness about Sikhs and build stronger community alliances. And this includes school board members, superintendents, chiefs of police, mayors, governors, and various commissions out there. And this is how we've been working on the advocacy front in advocating against hate crimes and prevention.
That's great. Thank you. And Avid?
Yes. Thank you. Thank you for having me here. ADC started in 1980 by Senator James Eberisk, and the initial focus was to combat the negative stereotypes of Arabs in the media and in the public image. And I don't know how many of you have watched or know of the app scam scandal, which is in the movie American Hustle, where they sent in FBI agents as Sikhs to try to persuade senators and congressmen to do business with them. But ADC started after that that incident. So for the first part of ADC's history, a lot of the focus was on the media and the way the Arab community is stereotyped. And there was work on hate crimes in the 80s and 90s. In fact, we have hate crimes reports dating back to from our inception, from our first year, and they were very thin. But as the years moved on, and particularly after 9/11, that hate crimes report got a little bit bigger. After 9/11, we were forced to switch our strategy a little bit, put more money into our legal department, and determine what's the best way to address these hate crimes. Now, the hate crimes reporting did not have an Arab hate crime category. It existed in the 90s, and then it went away a few years after it was implemented. So for the first part of the 2000s, there was no category tracking hate crimes against the Arabs. So we knew one of our first things that we had to do was to get that category, and we worked heavily with the Sikh Coalition on having an Arab category and a Sikh category put on the hate crimes reporting form a few years ago. So that was the first thing we determined we had to do and move forward with. Addressing hate crimes from a community perspective, it's difficult. A lot of the issues we have is that the underreporting. Community members don't want to come forward, or community members just don't know that they're victims of hate crimes. And it's very difficult to determine exactly what happened or get a story, or they just don't know where to go. So similar to what the Sea Coalition has done, and to go out to the communities, first talk to the local police departments, talk to the local mayors, elected officials, and those responsible for addressing crimes in the community, say, hey, here's what a hate crime looks like, here's how you can deal with our community. The second prong we had to implement was to go out to the communities and train them to tell them, here's what a hate crime looks like, here's what you can do, here's what your options are. And we've done that in cities across the country. We continue to do that, but it still hasn't had the impact we want. There's still, in our opinion, significant underreporting, and that's the focus we have now as ADCs. How do we get our community to step forward and say when they are victims of hate crimes? And combating hate crimes as a whole to stop them, of course, is a massive effort and undertaking that involves all our work, all the organizations up here, to determine how we can change the mindset and stop this rhetoric that leads to the hate crimes.
Thanks. Robert, just from the Justice Department's perspective, what is being done, or what are some of the challenges around data collection? And just so folks know, we still have in our midst in this country a very sizable, I'm going to get you the percentage when I look on my phone, but maybe you know the percentage of municipalities over 100,000 people who are still not reporting hate crime data to the FBI. They're either not reporting it or they are reporting zero, which has raised a lot of questions about what we're going to talk a little bit about, kind of police community trust and what the importance is on for that on hate crimes reporting. But if you could just talk a little bit about the data piece, and then Kristen, I'm going to turn to you on that as well.
Sure. Well, there are two primary sources of hate crimes data, right? One is the Uniform Crime Report, which is produced by the FBI, which is really sort of the law enforcement perspective. And then the other is the National Crime Victims Survey, which is a survey of people throughout the United States who believe that they've been victims of various kinds of crimes. And just like the UCR applies to murder and assault and all kinds of things, it also records hate crimes reported by state and local police. Because if you really think about it, who first identifies a hate crime is a beat cop, a cop that's going out to what may just be an assault or a beating or a disturbance on the street. And one of our challenges that maybe we can talk about later is hate crimes are typically identified not by the FBI, but by your local cop, right, on the street. So for data reporting, the UCR is a voluntary system. So police departments can choose voluntarily whether or not to report crime data, including hate crimes data, to the federal government. And it's a kind of complicated way. There are different ways to report it. But the point being that it's completely voluntary, and a number of jurisdictions don't do it. And there are all kinds of reasons why they don't do it. Sometimes it's capacity. There's 18,000 police departments in the United States. Some of them are really tiny, and they might say, we don't have the capacity. You have places like, I think, the state of Mississippi. Nobody in the state of Mississippi reports a hate crime at all, ever. They just either report zero or do not report. And I can tell you we've prosecuted multiple hate crimes at the federal level in Mississippi. So, I mean, even the ones we prosecute are not reported. So there might be a spectrum of reasons, and I'm not imputing what Mississippi's is. I'm just saying that there's a spectrum of reasons why people may not report. Contrast that with the National Crime Victims Survey, which uses a slightly different definition of a hate crime. So it can include sort of, hate speech that you felt unfairly targeted you or something like that. So it's a little bit broader definition. And it is a victim self-report. I believe I was a victim. Now, and what's shocking about the National Crime Victims Survey, to go to Abid's point, is that they also ask, did you report this crime to law enforcement? And I think the number is something around 60% of victims say they don't report to law enforcement. So, I mean, I think both reporting itself in a reliable way is poorly done, and I think what we hear a lot from victims is that they're not reporting to the police. And so I think those are two really significant challenges that face us in law enforcement and that we have to be addressing.
And so there was and has been a lot of NGO efforts, and I'm going to, I think each of the panelists is going to speak to this from their own vantage point. around data collection and trying to get more visibility out there about the need in particularly vulnerable communities or immigrant communities where there's more kind of tepid feeling of vulnerability around reporting anything to law enforcement. And so the Leadership Conference and the Lawyers Committee launched a partnership to have an initiative on communities against hate. And the Leadership Conference's piece is to try to we've created a database, but where we are taking incoming from our community partners to be able to track and better collect the stories and data. There was a lot of concern also after the election that some of these communities would feel particularly vulnerable and unwilling to speak to law enforcement about these incidents. And so it was a resource that was created both to track and collect this data and to tell these stories and make these stories visible, but also through the Lawyers Committee to help victims and witnesses and survivors and organizations obtain legal resources and social services in their communities. And so, Kristen, if you could just talk a little bit more about the Lawyers Committee's work in this space, that'd be great.
Sure. So we know that there are about 2/3 of hate crimes that happen in our country that go unreported. And as Vanita noted, there are a number of groups that cut across different sectors that have come together for the Communities Against Hate Initiative, which is about connecting victims and communities with resources in their community to deal with the impacts of hate incidents that happen around them. It is anchored by a hotline, 8449-NO-HATE. And I'll share with you one recent success story. We had a Latino couple that recently contacted us. They were shopping in a store in their community, and someone in their neighborhood accosted them in the store and was yelling racial and xenophobic slurs at them. This was an elderly couple, and they didn't know what to do. We encourage people to call law enforcement because we recognize how important it is that the federal data we have complete and accurate information about the hate incidents that happen around them. But this couple, this elderly couple, needed help. Often people don't feel comfortable calling local law enforcement for help, access to the social services and legal resources they need. Sadly, sometimes local law enforcement isn't equipped, frankly, to help victims and impacted individuals. Because we're rolling up our sleeves and understanding the kind of network of available services on the ground, we were able to connect this couple with a resource in their community that provided mental health support. The husband, as it turns out, was in his 80s and decided to just hide out at home for over a week. He was afraid to literally step outside of his home because of what happened. So we were able to connect him with mental health support services that were provided through an Arab American organization in the community. And so we're addressing hate by realizing that it's important to report to police, but people sometimes are needing access to social services, sometimes needing access to lawyers, and there's nobody kind of on the ground who's providing that comprehensive service delivery. So really proud of the work that we're doing and doing in partnership with different groups around the country. When we think about it, the victims of hate are very vulnerable. We're seeing hate incidents unfold across campuses. We're seeing hate and bullying unfold across our nation's schools. Nobody is immune from hate, and it's really important that when hate incidents rear their ugly head, that we're working with parents to figure out how they can navigate the school system to address bullying that may be ignored. We need to work with people inside workplaces who may face a hostile work environment, but an employer who's turning a blind eye to the issues. We need to help people in the housing context who may face hate as part of an effort to drive out African Americans or immigrants or LGBT people from a community. Landlords have an obligation to provide a safe space for residents. So this is part of the service delivery that we're doing. We're educating people about the laws in their community. We're educating people about the resources that might be available to them. And we're also recognizing that there's more work that law enforcement can do in this space. We forged a partnership with the International Association of Chiefs of Police, an umbrella organization for law enforcement agencies across the country and across the globe, because they must do more to address the hate crime crisis and to make fighting hate crimes more effectively a priority. We've been able to have some good closed-door conversations where we're talking honestly about what's happening and what's not happening. And at the most recent IACP convention in Philadelphia, and I know, Vanita, that you were there as well, and a resolution was introduced in large part through our efforts where they are committing to making fighting hate crimes a priority. That's one step in the right direction. It doesn't get us over the hump, but if we're going to overcome the hate crime crisis, we know that law enforcement must do more, must do better, and that they are a critical partner to have around the table when we talk about how we fight back and deal with the crisis we face.
Yeah, and Sim, can you speak a little bit about the role of the Sikh Coalition and what you think the role of community ad organizations is, both to help address I would say it's a crisis in data collection, but also in kind of providing some protections for your communities, or some awareness that the importance of reporting these things to law enforcement in order to be able to address them, to make that a reality? What is some of the work that Sikh Coalition is doing with your community?
So, specifically when it comes to hate crimes, we've been working a lot with, like I said, our grassroots outreach, but we also advocated for the FBI to track anti-Sikh bias incidents, anti-Hindu, and a whole host of other categories that were not there in the past. And I know that Abed had talked about that briefly. But that's just one way that demonstrates the issue of the hate crime data that's a problem. And sometimes, if policymakers don't have accurate visibility into the magnitude of hate crimes, we think that they won't take it seriously. We collect data regularly in society today, like test scores, traffic infractions, and the like, but somehow hate crime is not treated as seriously. And that's reflected in the fact that the data reporting is voluntary, as Robert had highlighted. So we need to find ways to get law enforcement agencies to report hate crime statistics. And there are cities like Miami, which are major jurisdictions, that report 0 hate crimes affirmatively. And that's kind of hard to believe in major cities like that. And that's not the only example. There's numerous other major cities that have this problem. And sometimes, we were at the International Chiefs of Police as well, and we've heard from the chiefs of police. Sometimes police are motivated by commercial factors. It's a tourism hotspot. We don't want to show that there's hate crimes in this area. So they want to affirmatively report 0. And there are other motivating factors, but these are some of the steps that we're working towards to try to resolve. Now, on the victim side, we've also got a big problem of underreporting. And that's a big theme in our messaging and advocacy. We need to close that data gap. Victims need to feel comfortable reporting to police, and we need to remove these impediments. This apprehension can be reduced by reducing any police profiling, ICE raids that might sometimes cause misidentification. I mean, some of the migrant community might not know the difference between an ICE agent and the sheriff's office. To them, they're all the same, and it creates that level of fear. And the bigger thing is that law enforcement needs to build community relations. They need to better understand their communities, and we need to eliminate the perception and fear that law enforcement's out there to profile people. And that really requires a cultural and attitude shift. But overall, we're looking for a more holistic approach, because we realize that hate crime actually starts early on. Hate is kind of taught. And we see that in schools, right? We have bullying cases that are occurring. And later on, that spills on, when they graduate from school, that spills onto the streets. And that can then bleed over into employment areas. So we've really wanted to try to work towards a paradigm shift in educating, because there's this hyper focus on reading, writing, and math. But where's the focus on character development? We need to teach students and children at a young age to appreciate diversity, so that when they are older, people that look different don't look alien to them. And when they are older, it's actually harder to reprogram them in that sense. That's the type of work that we've been working on with the Sikh community.
That's great. Abed, could you speak to the same issue about what ADC has been doing in the space as well.
Sure. It's, a lot of it parallels similar to what the Sikh Coalition, that's getting out on the ground and getting to the grassroots, working directly with the membership. Look, it's an interesting time to be an Arab or Muslim under this administration. I mean, that's the elephant in the room is a lot of these hate crimes and a lot of these people now feel emboldened because of what they're hearing from elected officials and even our president. And just take a look at some of the campaign ads that are running in Virginia and in other states. People are feeling emboldened to commit hate crimes. And we're reaching a point where there could be a great increase as a result of this. I mean, it's steadily going up, but there could be more. We haven't hit the ceiling yet in what's ahead of us. So one of the things we've had to undertake recently is to work on letting elected officials know, hey, your rhetoric is leading to hate crimes. Your rhetoric is leading to people in your community being attacked, being profiled, being harassed, being bullied. We did not have to do this after 9/11. I mean, after 9/11, surprisingly, Bush and his rhetoric was kind of calm. I mean, he had other issues with programs that were implemented, but there was not that rhetoric against the other communities coming from leadership in this country. So that's what I feel has changed between now and then. So that we've had to implement programs and implement a strategy on how do we reach our elected officials and let them know this is leading to hate crimes and it needs to stop. The work with the police departments has to continue. The work on a local level has to continue. We have to educate the police departments on what to look for, how to work with the Arab community, how to identify hate crime, how to approach. And all this stuff is pretty standard that a lot of the organizations are doing, will continue to do. One initiative we pushed for under the prior administration was trying to tie federal funding to the reporting of hate crimes. That did not, I mean, we had some support from the community side, but that didn't really pick up with, on the government side. That's something we may continue to try to push, something we believe should be pulled in, and how to force these municipalities to report hate crimes. So there is a lot of work, but right now I would say the priority for ADC is reaching these elected officials and telling them to tone down the rhetoric just a little bit so we can at least start seeing a decrease in the number of incidents.
Robert, so a couple of times, some of the panelists have brought up the role of the state and local governments and law enforcement in the role of preventing and addressing hate violence. And I'm just curious about, when I was at the Justice Department, we were working on this, there was a lot of work being done on training with law enforcement. You alluded to some of that. Can you talk right now about what the responsibility is, or what the role of state and locals are in also preventing and addressing hate violence, and also some of the Justice Department's ongoing efforts today to work with state and locals to address some of the problems that have been identified?
Sure. I mean, most hate crimes are identified by cops on the street, as I said before. And really, if you think about it, that's almost where the most critical decision point happens is, does the cop who's responding to an act of violence know how to gather evidence in that very important first couple of hours to say, is this just an assault, or why did it, what's the motivation of this assault, and what kinds of evidence might I need to be looking for to figure out if this is a hate crime? And I think that's just such a critical moment. And that presents a challenge because in the United States, we have diffuse police departments. We have 18,000 different police departments, each with their own training, each with their own chief, each with their own policies and procedures, each with their own jurisdiction. And so there's a real challenge about how do we reach out to these officers and train them to better identify hate crimes. I think what we're also seeing is in big cities are now recognizing that hate violence is a real crisis in their communities, and the way that these crimes are different than assaults, as everybody here said, is it completely tears your community apart. I mean, there's so much downstream effects. Not only is the victim themselves harmed, but entire communities, and not just the community that's affiliated with the victim, but the entire broad fabric of communities are really hurt when hate crimes happen. So large cities in particular, we're seeing right now, are really recognizing this. And that's why you've seen, I think in the 1990s, you saw a lot of states start passing hate crime statutes. There are a number of state hate crime statutes now, but boy, are they a patchwork. Some cover race, handful cover gender identity, some cover sexual orientation, some make it just a 1 or 2 year sentencing enhancement, some make it a significant crime. There's a lot of variability among the states in how they handle it, although more are starting to handle it. And that's good, but I think a lot of work remains to be done by advocates at the state level to try to get better and stronger hate crime statutes.
And just, sorry, I'm interrupting for 1 second. I think like 5 states still do
don't.
not have any statute
South
whatsoever.
Carolina, where
Where-
Dylan Roof walked in and shot all of those people in that church, 9 people, has no hate crime statute. And after that incident, they took down the flags, but the Confederate battle flags, but they still don't have a hate crime statute. And so I think that there's a lot of work to be done because I have 60 prosecutors in DC, and I can work with a bunch of AUSAs, but compared to the number of district attorneys in this United States and the number of line police officers, that's where the real power is. That's where the real criminal justice power is in so many aspects of criminal justice work. So what we're doing to try to help with that is, the Attorney General, one of his first things when he became AG was to create a task force on crime reduction and public safety. And part of that, there's only like 6 or 7 subcommittees. One of them is on hate crimes. Hate crimes is a priority for this Attorney General. I meet with him regularly on hate crimes. He considers them an aspect of, critical aspect of his violent crime program, combating violent crime program. So our hate crime subcommittee brought together a bunch of people from DOJ, and we're really trying to figure out 2 questions. One, how can we as federal prosecutors and investigators do a better job? But almost more importantly, what can we be doing to help state and locals? One, what can we be doing to increase data reporting? Like, how can we actually identify some places that aren't reporting hate crimes data and get them to do a better job? And 2, how can we partner with state and locals to increase their capacity to identify and prosecute hate crimes? And as Vanita said in the last administration, one of the things we did was a whole series of trainings where we brought community groups, local police, and federal law enforcement together, and we would have these really significant events and trainings, partly training, part kind of public town hall communication session, where we were trying to get people to build bridges between community groups where victims might report and trusted local law enforcement and trusted federal law enforcement to do a better job of helping victims report to people that they had trust in. We're going to revive those, and we hope to be doing a number of those over the next year. And we're also trying to identify good state and local prosecution authorities where there are, say, some places like Phoenix and New York have local hate crime specialized police units that go out and look for hate crimes, and they train their people, and then they've got DAs who can recognize that this is an important case and bring it. How can we figure out what those state and locals are doing well, and is there an opportunity for us as the federal government to amplify that, to give an opportunity to other police departments and DA's offices who want to do better to learn what some best practices are? So we're trying to both figure out what can we do on the federal side, but how can we lift up state and locals and provide maybe some roadmap of best practices to help them also enforce their own statutes, improve their statutes and enforce their statutes.
So one of the things I want to pick up on what Sim and Avid both said was that in doing this work, we have to understand that hate doesn't just happen in this vacuum, that policies that promote discrimination, rhetoric, especially official rhetoric, can help to create an environment that legitimizes or normalizes hate that we've been seeing, and that is a huge concern. And so the work isn't just around data collection, it isn't only around it, but it's deeply important around kind of federal, state, and local partnerships to train local law enforcement who are at the front lines to detect and identify and investigate appropriately hate incidents when they happen, having legislation at the state level to ensure adequate prosecution. So all of these things are features of it. But we are also seeing more and more the problem of hate online. And Kristen, you alluded to this issue early on, and this week we're having some momentous hearings in Congress with Facebook, Google, and Twitter talking about how their platforms were used or exploited by Russian agitators in our election, but that we're using the platform to promote hate. But there is also real concern around white supremacy platforms online. And so I know the Lawyers Committee has been both working on this. I think it would be interesting for this room, which has got the private bar included, to talk about the role of the private bar and what the Lawyers Committee has been doing in one of your recent cases as well.
Sure. Yeah, there is absolutely a critical role for the private bar to play right now. It is, I think, not possible for the federal government, for Robert Musi and his 60 lawyers, or for the civil rights organizations represented here and not represented here to do all the work that needs to be done in this space. And we're truly at a crisis moment. The Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law actually relies on and depends on pro bono support to carry out its work. We have a board that's comprised of more than 200 private lawyers across the country. I see one of them in the back, Eleanor Smith, who's one of our closest partners in work to combat hate. So there is a really central role for lawyers to play right now, supplementing, amplifying some of the existing work and efforts that are happening. One thing that we realize right now is that we've got to be creative in how we attack this problem. When we talk about hate, right, there is the First Amendment, and that always looms. We have to remember that one of the most important rights in our democracy is the right to free speech. But the First Amendment does not protect the right to incite violence, to use speech to incite violence. And what we've seen online is that this is a space that is not regulated, and it's a platform that white supremacists freely use to organize and incite violence very frequently. I want to take just a moment to talk about one action that we recently took against a website called Stormfront. Stormfront is the oldest and longest running hate site online. It's been in existence for about 25 years. It's got about 100,000 registered users, but millions of people across the country and globe who frequent the site on a regular basis. There are chat rooms and forums where people talk and spew all kinds of horrendous ideas, notions about African Americans, LGBT people, Latinos, and a lot of that is, vicious conduct protected by the First Amendment. But throughout the years, there have been more than 10 murders that have been directly linked to organizing activity carried out on the Stormfront platform. Charlottesville, there are many people who organized and planned around the ugly, vicious protests in Charlottesville on the Stormfront platform. And so what we decided to do was we reached out to the web host for Stormfront, a company called Network Solutions. They have an acceptable use policy that people who use their services have to agree to. When they agree to have Network Solutions host their website. And part of that acceptable use policy prohibited people from using their services to carry out violence. And so we said, Network Solution, well, here are examples of murders that are directly linked to this website that you host. We think it's time that you start enforcing your own acceptable use policy. And they did. They pulled Stormfront down. So for the first time in more than 25 years, this site went dark. And it sent white supremacists into a tizzy. In our office, we faced death threats and saw the backlash from the work. But what we did was we disrupt their ability to incite violence. Sadly, a few weeks ago, they found a new company that has provided, is now hosting the site, a company called Tuco's out in the Silicon Valley. So we are continuing our work. But we deem this a success story because for 2 months, on the heels of Charlottesville, this kind of key main hub that had been used for them to discuss and organize and incite wasn't there. And they had nowhere else to go. It's like, roaches when you turn the lights on. And so this is work that we are carrying out in partnership and with support from the private bar. I think we are at a moment where we really have to be creative in thinking about how we attack and fight back. as Robert Musi knows and has laid out for us, there's a patchwork of laws across the country, some with teeth, but many without the teeth that we really need to combat hate in all of the vicious ways it's manifesting itself right now. And so through creativity, I think that we can kind of penetrate and make some progress in this space.
Yeah. And I'm going to open it up for questions shortly, but one of the interesting things too is that private companies also have are kind of understanding that they may have a role to play in preventing hate. So around Charlottesville, Airbnb, which has community standards that every user has to agree to abide by when interfacing in order to get beyond on their website, actually denied some of the known white supremacist leaders who were all publicly known and affiliated with their organizations, denied them the ability to use Airbnb to use homes and live in Charlottesville in that weekend in August. And so it's, again, I think more businesses are also, because they have different responsibilities. Sometimes they have their own community standards, and I think this is some of the conversation that's happening with regards to Facebook and Twitter and Google right now. Obviously, we've got, as I said, the First Amendment, but private companies have a different set of standards on some of these issues internally that they've created. And so it's an interesting time where a lot of this area of the law and policy is being tested out in the private sector, even as we talk about the Justice Department's important work in this area and the responsibility of state and locals and the responsibility of community organizations. So I just want each of the panelists to close out before we open it up to any questions any of you may have about, and Kristen, you started to speak to this, but Sam, what do you think the role of the legal community can be to prevent and address hate violence from where you sit?
So with regards to the legal community, we have a legal team as well, and we try to work closely with the victims that are affected with hate crime. And the number one thing that we do whenever we're involved in a hate crime incident is that we'll work with the local officials and ask them the number one question: is this being treated as a hate crime? And sometimes the answer is uncertain or unclear. So as a community organization, we try to make sure that if they have the resources or capacity, that they should properly prosecute that issue as a hate crime. But if not, we make sure to always be in touch with the FBI. And hate crime victims don't know sometimes to be in touch with the FBI so that they can get the proper support. There's tracking that's put in place, and sometimes we can look at the federal prosecution aspect as well. Because there's just opaqueness in government. It's not clear that people know who to report to sometimes. So it's really important, at least for community organizations, to establish those lines of connections before an incident happens, because time is critical. Because if you're trying to establish those lines of communication when a hate incident occurs, you're losing some precious time, and you could be putting the client at risk there. But I just want to stress that it's important for community organizations to continue to maintain those channels and use that for training and other proactive measures to reduce the mishandling of community trust. Because if the hate crime is not prosecuted as a hate crime, you have the victim and community feeling marginalized, and that also feeds into the reporting problem, as we talked about earlier.
Robert.
I think I'm assuming who all in this room is a lawyer? Are most people lawyers? I mean, you're sort of I'm a lawyer too. Some of the most empowered people in our communities, particularly if you're in the criminal justice space, or you're part of a firm or part of a government prosecution or defense entity. I would say for those of you who aren't in the federal government, whether you're a state and local or with a firm, particularly if you're not from DC or if you have firms that are outside of DC, look and see, does your city report, and what's your state hate crime statute? How does it compare to Shepherd Bird? And then start advocating. You may have access to chiefs of police, or people in your firms may have access to chiefs of police, and it might be a really good question to say, do you guys report hate crimes? And if not, why not? And what's the obstacle, and why aren't you doing it? Or if you have access to leadership in your communities, say, how's our hate crime statute compare? Do we have a strong hate crime statute? Because I really think it's up to the people who are the most empowered, and I'm assuming if you're here, you're one of those people, and if you're here, you care about these issues, to go out to your communities and try to get improvements done locally, because I do think there's a lot of work to do there. There's a lot of, and I think my guess is there are organizations that you can partner with to help do that and figure out talking points and things, but I think that is such a critical thing that I don't see being done, and it's in some ways could cause a lot of change around data reporting and around legal structures, which, as I started in the beginning, kind of goes to how law enforcement are trained, how they're prioritized. It really has these ripple effects throughout your community that can benefit your community.
Kristen, thank you.
So a few quick thoughts. One, I think that it's really important that we have around the country on-the-ground efforts advocating to improve state laws around hate crimes. Robert Musi noted the patchwork, but if we're not silent about it, if we're not working with partners and existing groups to advocate for reform, nothing's going to change. So regardless of what the kind of political picture may look like in your state, I encourage folks to think about mobilizing a campaign and working with partners to advocate for improving state laws around hate crimes. Consider reaching out to your local district attorney and local law enforcement agency and tell them that they should make hate crimes a priority. The examples of DA offices and police departments that have real rich, rigorous, units that are focused on identifying and fighting hate crime are few and far between. So unless we ask for it, it's not going to happen. I think that lawyers can play a creative role here in thinking about tort and civil remedies for victims of hate crimes. We've been working with partners like Legal Services Alabama and the Southern Poverty Law Center to help think about the kind of range of tort and civil remedies that aren't typically used but could be used to bring relief to victims of hate crimes. Support organizations that are engaged in this fight, because we are doing work at a very intense level, and whether that support comes by way of pro bono support or by way of a donation to support our fight, I think this is a moment to really just step up and show leadership. And then wherever you are, whether you represent a law firm or a law school or a corporation, encourage leadership at the highest levels to speak out when a hate crime crisis unfolds. I think that it was really remarkable in the wake of Charlottesville to see, for example, CEO leaders from Fortune 500 companies who had the courage to say something, to talk about how hate is anti-American. It stands against the values of their company. And to me, it stands out those who chose to be silent and stay outside the fray. So to the extent that you have the ability to influence and shape how leadership uses its voice, and when it uses its voice at the entity that you represent, I think that there's a lot of value in that too.
Thank you. I just want to echo what my colleague said, and I'll just add quickly, the one area I would see attorneys could help in would be offering pro bono services to the victims. Oftentimes at our organization, if we have a victim of a hate crime, we need to connect them with an attorney so they know their options, they know how to go through the process, they feel more comfortable when talking with law enforcement, and it goes a long way. So if you could volunteer, I would just add volunteer with a local organization, volunteer with a national organization, or just say, hey, I'll be on call if something happens in my community, and that does go a long way. I'd also add to speak out, and if you do have access to elected officials, you do have access to people in your community, let them know that this rhetoric, if they are engaged in it, this rhetoric is harmful. And coming from attorneys, coming from the professional community will really have an impact in hopefully tuning that down a little bit.